Welcome to Aquatics by Nature. It's currently spring here, so this week I thought I'd show you one of my current outdoor aquatic projects. I've always kept lots of water plants in tubs and even small raised ponds, and as my regular viewers will know, I owned a water garden nursery for many years, so keeping things in tubs has always been convenient for me and something that I've pretty much always done. It's also a really lovely and really easy way to be able to enjoy and observe all the wonders of these little outdoor aquatic environments. You'll be absolutely amazed how much wildlife a simple tub water garden can actually bring to your garden. It's really quite fantastic, and I can often be found, as I've said many times before, actually leaning over these tubs with a magnifying glass in summer, just observing everything that's going on. It's a really fascinating little thing to be able to do. And this time of the year, I cannot resist the temptation to be outdoors. Spring is simply wonderful, and that goes for ponds, gardens, and basically everything that's outside. And whilst tubs and barrels, etc., are really far from being natural, I still like to set them up in a way that enables them to sort of function as naturally as possible. In that way, as I say, you'll be absolutely amazed by the amount of life that these little tubs can actually support. It's really rather like my fish tanks, and I tend to keep things as simple and practical as possible, and then I can just really sit back and enjoy them for the summer. This year anyway, I've decided to set up around a dozen or so of these big round tubs, and the idea really is to pick a couple of my favourite marginal plants and one sort of specimen lily for each individual tub. I'll keep things really simple and actually quite dramatic. I rather like the sort of slightly more architectural kind of pond plants. They kind of go with the sort of Mediterranean type theme of my garden. And you'll also notice later in the year that I deliberately only choose to use the clump forming kind of marginal plants. And I generally don't use things that run everywhere. This is partly, as I say, just an aesthetic thing because I like the more sort of architectural things, but it also helps to keep maintenance to a minimum. And when you've got lots of tubs like I have, that's always quite important. Once these plants are actually actively growing, I'll actually do an update video and actually run through the exact varieties. But for the moment, I'll just put a little list up on screen, and a list maybe in the description as well, just so you get an idea of what things I'm growing. Anyway, the tubs themselves they're just over 3 feet in diameter, so they're about 1 metre in diameter. And they're about a foot deep, about 30 centimetres deep, sort of give or take a little bit anyway. And one of the things that I've really found over the years is that the way in which these tubs are actually set up actually has a really quite a big long-term effect, or certainly a big influence. How these tubs actually perform generally always works best if you can actually balance things naturally. And that also makes for a much lower maintenance environment. So as I say, you can sit back much more and actually enjoy it. And we all like to have nice clear water and sort of minimal algae. So this is all very much the same set of basic principles that I use in my aquaria. And probably the most important factor here is actually the kind of soil that you use to actually grow your plants in. I don't use anything complicated at all. Literally all I use is simply unfertilised garden soil. Literally all I do is dig soil out of the ground and then just sieve it to remove the sort of twigs and sort of stones and any sort of foreign objects that are actually in it. I should stress here that I use as poor a soil as I can. It's all unfertilised garden soil. I tend to actually dig it out from under the lawn as much as anything, because that's an area that doesn't get fertilised or actually disturbed. Anyway, within the confines of these sort of small ponds, tubs, whatever you want to call them, I've always found that, same with many aquatic environments, limiting nutrients is something that is quite a big issue in actual fact, and especially if you want to actually maintain a really simple, healthy, natural equilibrium, something that you have kind of minimum kind of influence over. You just leave it to nature, as it were. So, let's say, just minimal maintenance and minimal messing around. It also tends to lead to much clearer water with, again, much less effort. So it's definitely the direction that I've always gone. The pots I actually choose to put my plants in are actually these very fine mesh pond baskets. You'll notice I stress the fine mesh type. I don't particularly like the ones with coarser mesh because the soil does tend to slip out of them quite quickly, especially if the plants aren't really well rooted in them. And even with these baskets, I actually tend to still line them either with paper, or in this particular case, I put a little bit of horticultural fleece in first. As I say, this really just stops the soil from slipping out before the roots of your plants are actually really well established. But there is also another sort of really useful reason that I actually choose these mesh baskets over sort of solid pots or anything like that. The first reason really is just that pond plants, in my experience, absolutely hate having the roots confined in solid pots. They rarely thrive until they've actually escaped these sort of confines, as it were. So by using these sort of mesh baskets, it enables this from the start. The roots actually have a sort of a free run. And it also enables the roots to actually take up nutrients from the water much more easily and the surrounding area, which will ultimately lead to better growth, and it'll help keep the algae at bay as well, and just help to keep the sort of general balance, as it were. You may also notice that I've actually placed these mesh baskets actually inside sort of bigger tubs, as it were. This is not something that's essential, but it's something that I actually quite like to do, simply because it stops the root systems of different marginal plants from actually growing into each other. It still gives them freedom to actually explore a little bit into the water and what have you, but it just makes maintenance in the long term easier. It's much easier to lift out a single marginal than have a big block of different ones all rooted in together, which can be extremely heavy and difficult to do, because inevitably at some point in the future they'll need to be split up and divided because they will become too big for these kind of tub gardens. The water lily, on the other hand, will actually be not contained at all. It'll be within its mesh container, but the roots will then have the free run of the rest of the tub, as it were, so they can spread out really quite extensively. Because if you're not familiar with water lilies, they have really extensive root systems, and it's only really when these root systems can explore the mulm and the leaf litter, etc., that builds up on the bottom of your pond, that they grow really strongly and beautifully under these sort of natural conditions. I should also point out that these subs are actually in full sun. They literally get sun from about 8 AM to 8 PM from this time of the year onwards into the summer. The reason that I choose this position is that not only do you get the best plant growth, but you get much better flowering. So especially if you're growing things like water lilies, if you grow them in the shade, you tend to get very poor flowering. So it's much nicer if they get plenty of sunlight. And it's also much nicer to enjoy things when they're sort of brightly lit up, as it were. Anyway, once the plants themselves are actually sort of potted and put in place, I literally just gently fill it up with tap water, making sure not to actually disturb the soil in the pots while I'm doing it. You can actually choose, if you want to actually put some gravel on top of the soil just to help keep things in initially if you want to. And some people like to do it just because it looks nice, but it's not actually essential. It's just one of those things that you can choose to do. Anyway, I then tend to just leave the tub for a week or two, something like that. And in actual fact, I left these tubs here for about a week. And as you can see, literally in that just week that we've had, there's been a reasonable amount of sun here. And there's already some algae actually developing on the surface. Partly it's come from the fact that most of these marginal plants were actually potted up a couple of weeks ago and were transferred. So that's actually sort of accelerated this a little bit. But I should point out that because of the sort of initial chaos of a new pond sort of ecosystem, this algae will inevitably get worse before it gets better. This is something that is absolutely normal. It doesn't mean anything is wrong or anything is going to crash or cause you any great problems. It's really just part of the settling down process. And one of the things that I've learned more than anything else over the years is it's absolutely critical at this point to actually not to go trying to change water or add any chemicals or mess around with the environment. It's one of those phases that a pond really has to go through. And until it's gone through that phase, it can't really come out the other side of it, certainly not consistently and sort of in a nice sort of stable way. And it's really just that attaining a natural balance and a natural sort of equilibrium, it just takes a little bit of time. You know, nature works on different timescales to perhaps you and I would like, but it's something, if you just persevere, it'll sort itself out. That said, that there are actually a few sort of tried and tested things that I tend to do to actually help things along. It's always much better if you can just tip things in the sort of right direction rather than literally just leaving it alone. Now as I say that these tubs are actually a week or two old, you've actually got, as I say, a little bit of algae in them, which means that there is actually a little bit of the start of the sort of fledgling ecosystem actually starting to take place. Things are actually starting to kick off. So rather than thinking of algae as a negative thing, it's actually just a sign that the ecosystem is starting to tick over and the first stages are actually starting to happen. So anyway, the very first thing that I tend to do, as I say, literally a couple of weeks after the tub has been filled, is I actually add Daphnia, which if you're not familiar with Daphnia, they're what's commonly called water fleas, which I know doesn't sound very nice, but like, don't worry, they can't jump out and get on you or anything. They're purely aquatic. Anyway, all I do is I literally collect these Daphnia from my other ponds. Inevitably, because these are collected from my ponds, there'll actually be all kinds of different critters. So not only will it be Daphnia, there'll be things like Cyclops and probably other little sort of detritus worms and all kinds of things in it, as it were. But if you don't have access to ponds or friends' ponds and things that you can actually collect Daphnia from, you can actually normally buy it as a live fish food. And you don't actually need very much of it. So even just buying a portion of sort of live fish food will be plenty to actually seed one of these little tubs. But the most important thing, as I say, is don't add the Daphnia until the tub has had a little while to settle down and you start to see the first signs of algae. It's mainly because waterborne algae are actually Daphnia's sort of main food source. So if you put them in too early, there is a risk that they could starve to death, or that the water is still simply too new and they're actually not able to survive in it. And as I say, you only need a very small amount of Daphnia to seed these sort of tubs. And Daphnia itself actually multiplies at a crazy fast rate in these new pond conditions. Because there are lots of nutrients leaching out of that fresh soil that you've just submerged, it creates lots and lots of green water algae, which is lots and lots of food for Daphnia. And it's one of the reasons that they're fantastic for sort of mopping this up. And hopefully I'll show you in a few weeks just how crazily fast Daphnia actually multiplies. One of the really good sort of side effects of this is if you do have an aquarium, it's a real bonus. You could then actually just collect the excess Daphnia and actually feed it to your aquarium fish, or actually pond fish for that matter, to be perfectly honest. But it's a real sort of boom that you get early in spring. And it's certainly a really good reason for setting up a tub in spring, because you'll find that once the tub is actually much better established and much better balanced, the population will actually fall right back because there won't be the same food ability, the actual food availability rather. But it's just a matter of the more food there is, the more Daphnia that you actually get. But at the end of the day, Daphnia are absolutely fantastic for keeping water clear. But unfortunately, they do very little to help actually other types of algae. And this kind of brings me on to what I would describe as step 2, if you like, for my kind of cleanup crew for these little tub gardens. The main sort of cleanup crew for the rest of it is actually snails. And ordinarily, I like to add as many different species of pond snails as I actually can, as diversity is always good in these kind of situations, as each species tends to actually have its own little sort of niche. Basically, each species tends to eat a slightly different kind of algae, and the more different species you have, the more you have kind of covered, as it were. So it's something that I would definitely recommend doing. But having said that, I'm actually going to try a bit of an experiment with these tubs. It's something that I've always intended to do and never quite got round to. So as these tubs are all actually new, just for fun, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to add just one species of snail to each tub. In that way, in a few weeks or months' time, I should actually be able to compare the different tubs later in the season, and I may hopefully see some slight differences in how the tubs settle down depending on what species I have. And I think this could actually be really quite interesting. And I'll also leave 1 or 2 tubs without any snails, because I think that would also show quite an interesting difference on actually how important it is to have these kind of grazing kind of cleanup crew actually in these tubs, and even small ponds, the same basic things apply. But it's not one of those things that will actually work long term. Simple reason for this is that inevitably I would have already inadvertently added other species of snails to these tubs, simply because I've moved plants from other ponds and things. It's just something that comes along. You'll get baby snails or even snail eggs on bits of plant. You really can't avoid them. And incidentally, I don't actually wash the pond plants before I plant or pot them. One of the reasons for this is that it does bring all kinds of different life to your pond. You'll pick up lots of sort of little detritus-eating annelid worms, little gamma shrimps, for example. Lots and lots of little things will be hanging on to, let's say, a water lily rhizome or something like that. And in any case, lots of these things like snails and even daphnia and things will actually get moved around by wildlife. Even things like birds and things tend to bring things into ponds and tubs, and even buckets you'll find you end up with pond snails in. It's amazing how things get there. You know, nature is just amazing. Life always finds a way. I've actually got daphnia and ostracods actually in my water butt that I collect rainwater in, and that's despite it having a really tight fitting lid. So goodness knows how they got in there, and it's pitch black in there and they still managed to survive. It's quite incredible. Anyway, some of the best snails in my experience are actually the ram's horn snail family, which some of you are probably quite familiar with because there's lots of different species, and some for aquariums, some for ponds, and some for both, most possibly. Anyway, I'm sure you'll find that there are different species actually in each country. So what you may need to actually do when looking at putting snails in these tubs is to actually do a little bit of Googling and actually find out which species are actually native to your particular region. And I'd definitely always recommend using native species. They tend to be the most useful, and they're no threat to your local environment either, so it's always an important thing. And certainly ram's horn snails, I've always found, all the different types that I've had actually in ponds, have always been really good algae eaters, and they don't tend to eat delicate plants, which is more than I can say for actually some species of snails that you can actually add or inadvertently get in tubs and ponds and things. And anyway, here in the UK, the most well known is the great ram's horn snail, which is Planoberius corneus. These are real monsters. They actually grow to potentially about 1.5 inches in diameter, which is about 40 millimeters, which is pretty sizable for a pond snail. And they're seriously good algae eaters and pretty good sort of cleanup crew, sort of detritivores as well. They're just fantastic creatures. I absolutely love them. And one of the great things is that they multiply like crazy in spring, particularly. That seems to be their sort of natural life cycle, as it were. They're just incredibly useful creatures to have in the pond, and as I say, I love them anyway. Anyway, literally all you need to do really is to add half a dozen or so of these kind of snails. It's really just to seed the new tub or little pond. You don't actually need that many. It is literally just a seeding process. And they actually come in a couple of different varieties. These ones are actually just the normal black-bodied ones, which are the most common. But you can also find some nice red-bodied ones from time to time. And I've actually chosen to add different colours to actually different ponds, just to kind of keep them separate. But there's no real reason to do it. They will interbreed, and you'll end up with ones that are sort of halfway house, which doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Not that I expect there to be actually any differences in their cleaning abilities, because I'm pretty sure there isn't. They're just the same species. But the only thing I am quite curious about is by keeping the red ones in a separate tub to the black ones, I'm actually curious to see if they actually survive as well, because I've noticed here that the birds in particular tend to pick them off as food. So I'm kind of curious to see if the red-bodied ones, because they're a bit more obvious, are actually a bit more at risk of this and actually maybe don't do quite as well as the black ones. But that's just a little experiment that I might report back on a bit later in the year. Anyway, the next sort of most common little snail that I like to utilise is another ram's horn snail, another little native. And it's just basically the normal common ram's horn, Planorbis planorbis. As you can see here, they're quite a flat species and a much smaller species. That they rarely grow more than about ½ an inch, maybe sort of 12 millimetres across, something like that. But they're very common in my hard water area, and they're extremely prolific breeders, maybe even a bit more so than the previous species. They build up really quite incredibly big populations in really no time at all. And whilst they're quite small, I rather like them. I think they're quite elegant little critters at the end of the day. Again, you really don't have to have many just to seed a new pond. So, you know, not much more than sort of half a dozen or so is normally fine for a tub or a small pond. And as I say, in different sort of geographical locations, you'll find there'll be different species that are native to your area and suitable for this. And I believe if you're in the United States, that the American ram's horn, which is Planobella durii, is actually your native ram's horn. In actual fact, these are the ones that I keep in my aquariums. I tend not to keep native ones in my aquariums because they don't seem to do very well at the constant high temperatures. So I've always found that I keep them indoors, and it's also, I don't like putting non-native creatures outside. I don't want them to escape into the environment. And the third snail that I'm actually going to add to these tubs is actually something I've mentioned again in my aquariums, and this is Bithynia tenticulata. I'm sure I've butchered the name, but you get the gist of it anyway. And these little guys are generally only about 1/4 inch or so, sort of 6 millimetres or so across. Although they can grow a little bit bigger, but they don't tend to in my tubs. But I found I get enormous populations of them in my ponds, and I think when you get very big populations, they tend to stay that little bit smaller, and they can certainly breed pretty prolifically. I have kept these also in aquariums, these ones. They seem to do quite well, and they do lay eggs pretty freely, that's definitely for sure. Anyway, something I noticed some years ago, which I thought was really interesting about these snails, is that the ponds or tubs that I had these particular snails in were always incredibly clear, much more so than other ponds. And even the sides of the ponds I always thought were incredibly clean. And I'm not sure if I've mentioned this before, because as I say, I've got some of these in some of my tanks, and not only do these snails actually graze algae, they actually have the amazing ability to actually filter feed as well. And it seems to me, looking at my ponds, that this is also occurring in some of my ponds. That the water clarity in ponds containing these is really quite exceptional, especially ponds where they've been in there for a while. And as I say, there's a really good sort of population of them. So it's something that I really wanted to try and test. So by having a tub with basically these in there, I should be able to kind of see whether this is actually consistent, which I think it probably is. So anyway, watch this space and hopefully we'll sort of find out together, as it were. Again, for those of you that are in other parts of the world, there are actually other species of snail that are actually capable of doing this filter feeding as well. So it's definitely one of those areas that's actually worth checking out if you're looking for sort of interesting and useful creatures to keep in small ponds and tubs and things like that. Anyway, a small sort of word of warning, if you like, with snail species is that some snails can be a little bit of a pest, and this goes especially for new environments, environments that are not sort of stable or are not in proper balance yet. For example, the greater pond snails that you see here, for example, which are Limnaea stagnalis. These are huge great things, which can be a couple of inches, sort of 5 or 6 centimetres across. And these guys can really chomp new plant leaves under certain circumstances. That's particularly a problem in spring. And especially if you have a new pond, because when you haven't got that much plant life in a new pond or a new tub, this is kind of exaggerated, and they can really make quite a mess of your plants. And I have actually lost plants in the past because of these species. They can be a bit annoying, so you have to be a little bit careful what you add. Inevitably though, as I said earlier, I would have already probably added these to my tubs because they live in most of my ponds, and they will have come in on probably actually on bits of plant, or actually as eggs or even baby snails. But hopefully by adding the more desirable species first in these new tubs, they'll kind of get the jump on this actual species first, so you'll get a better sort of equilibrium. And you'll find at this point anyway, they tend to cease to become a pest, and they just become part of the sort of diverse ecosystem that you've allowed to evolve. You just don't want too many of them at the beginning. Nature tends to readdress these things for you in the long run, but it does take a little bit of time. And I should point out that also by choosing just one snail species for each tub, it does somewhat go against this, so I am prepared for a few hiccups along the way. So definitely, if you get the chance, always try and add as many different species as possible, and then really just let nature kind of sort out and sort of address the balance of things for you, as it were. Now, I'm sure some of you are asking, well, I haven't got any ponds to actually collect snails from, so where can I get these kind of suitable snails for these tubs? Well, I'm not sure obviously what access people have in different countries, but certainly here in the UK, there are lots of online sort of wildlife suppliers that actually sell all of these different snails, and actually quite a few other critters as well, if you're actually interested in introducing a wider range of creatures, which is another sort of subject entirely. And as I said earlier, you really don't need that many to actually seed these sort of new environments. So even if you do have to buy them rather than actually just collect them yourself, you really don't need to spend a fortune. But I would say it's definitely something that is worthwhile, rather than just putting a few plants in a tub and expecting everything to balance. Things will work out much better if you help them along a bit in this way. And remember, you're really, as I say, just seeding the new system. The actual population will then become sort of self-regulating depending on food availability. So you tend to get a little bit of a boom and bust situation. You'll get a huge explosion of the Daphnia, followed by a huge explosion of the snails. And then as the actual environment settles down, you'll find that both of them, the actual population, will then shrink back. And you'll actually end up finding lots of empty snail shells on the bottom of your pond. So don't panic. Again, that is something that is entirely normal, and it's just part of that settling down sort of phase, as it were. So, okay, what kind of comes next? Well, it's mostly really just a matter of sitting back, watching, and just seeing how things evolve. The less you actually mess with these sort of very new environments, the better the end results tend to be, in my experience. But basically trying to add some strong growing plants, and a couple of weeks later adding a sort of reasonable sort of diverse sort of cleanup crew in, say, Daphnia and different snail species, it's really then just a matter of time before things actually settle down and really become something that's much more attractive and sort of more appealing on a sort of garden level, as it were. But always remember, when you set up these new tubs and ponds, they always tend to get worse before they get better. Patience is really key here. Don't expect everything to run smoothly and algae-free from the beginning, because that really very, very rarely happens. New tubs do take a little bit of time. And I know these tubs really don't look very much at this sort of initial stage, but I really wanted to show how things start out. And I hope in this way that I can sort of really just demonstrate how important it is to allow these natural ecosystems to evolve, even in these little tubs. And the same applies really to ponds and things. And my intention here really is to do a little series of videos sort of following the progress of these tubs throughout the season, so you can actually see how they go from sort of being fresh and new to probably quite green and slimy in another couple of weeks, and then they should gradually settle down from there onwards. So basically watch this space. And if you want to know more about how I maintain these tubs so naturally, without water changes, chemicals or fertilisers, I'd be eternally grateful if you'd subscribe and give me a like. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquatic exploits. Don't be a slave to them. Thanks for watching.